And we're back on political connections. And in Washington, a big part of the discussion in the Biden administration has been the infrastructure bill and Build Back Better. What does that mean for Florida, right? Especially now after the devastating impacts of Hurricane Ian. We caught up with Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, who was in Florida this week to talk about all that and more.
Secretary, thank you for joining us. I want to start with the infrastructure package. President Biden signed it into law about a year ago, $550 billion. As we look here in Florida, we've got Hurricane Ian we're now having to clean up and restore from. Long term, you look at Central Florida, our roadways, we are choking with traffic. There's a lot of needs. Realistically, what can Floridians and Central Floridians expect to see out of the infrastructure project? How are we going to benefit?
Well, it's going to impact Florida in so many positive ways. First, the good paying construction jobs of building and preparing this infrastructure, and then the benefit of using it for the rest of our lives. Right now, that means everything from improvements at the airport in Orlando that I'm going to be seeing during this visit, to over $2 billion headed toward roadway improvements that the state will be putting to use. That's this year alone, and that's just Florida's share. We're making improvements in the ports. I was at Port Tampa Bay just a few weeks ago, celebrating a grant that's going to help them add another berth and accommodate more ships. And even if you don't live or work anywhere near the port, you're going to benefit from that, because that means better supply chains, which helps keep costs under control on the shelves. Whether we're talking about airports, ports, transit, trains, roads, bridges, highways, you name it, it's going to benefit from this infrastructure funding, and we're already putting those dollars to work.
What's interesting here in Central Florida, we have Sunrail, which is our regional rail service, doesn't operate on holidays, doesn't operate on weekends, doesn't fully connect the whole region. We have linked bus transportation, which it's expanding, but for a lot of, especially tourism workers, they can spend 2-3 hours round trip a day getting to and from work. Florida is still one of the most dangerous states in the country for pedestrians and bicyclists. Orange County leaders are asking voters to approve a 1-cent sales tax hike. They want to try to generate billions of dollars to try to address these issues through projects. If voters were to say no, is there any role for the federal government to have funding sources to still help Orange County address some of these projects?
Well, we do have a lot of resources for transit, for safety improvements on roads, and for rail. But I'll also say, when a local community decides to step up, or when a state decides to step up and bring their own funds, that actually unlocks even more federal dollars. A lot of our programs have a matching requirement where we'll carry most of the load, but we need to know that the community has some skin in the game too. And so I don't know all the details of this local decision being made, but I do think it's important for states and local governments and residents to know it's not an either or. You certainly don't want to think that because the federal funding is coming, there's nothing to do locally. I would actually say, when communities choose to step up and invest in their transportation, then we're able to be a better partner on the federal side. There's more we can do to help.
You spoke about rail. We've got Brightline, near high-speed rail service, mostly privately funded, coming early next year. As we talked about, Sunrail and the desire to expand that here locally. You've mentioned in the past about how rail can be critical in meeting the transportation needs, not only from cargo, but passenger. What actually needs to happen, especially if you think of areas like Central Florida, to make rail? We don't have a setup like London or DC or New York. So what would have to happen to make rail feasible long-term in the future to moving people and goods around?
Well, I've been very impressed with what I've seen in Florida in terms of the work that's going on toward more and more excellent rail service. Whether it's the Sunrail that I saw going by when I went for a morning run on the Orlando Urban Trail there, or the vision for Brightline, which will have new speeds, new destinations. And we want to make sure that we're supporting that any way we can. The truth is, America as a whole has not really done nearly enough compared to the rest of the developed world to have excellent options for rail and in many cases transit for passengers. But it's very important that we do that. It benefits, there are safety benefits when we get it right. There are climate benefits. It's definitely a more climate friendly way to get around. Even people who don't use it, benefit from the people who do, because the more people have a great rail option, the less congestion there is on the roads. We're investing in roads and bridges, but when you see the levels of congestion that we're seeing sometimes in Florida, you can't just pave your way out of the problem. You need different options, different solutions, and excellent passenger and commuter rail is a big part of that.
And part of the mindset, though, especially Americans, we love our cars, and especially our gas-guzzling cars. With electric vehicles, there are environmental concerns that some critics have had, but also the cost of electric vehicles as well. With the major automakers going to EVs, how realistically can we make EV a sustainable option that's environmentally friendly, if you will, but also affordable to the middle class?
One thing we've really been pushing to do is to lower the cost of buying an electric vehicle, because we know that if you can afford to purchase one, then you're going to see savings in terms of gas and in terms of maintenance. They usually require less maintenance. Now we're seeing the costs come down. You can get a good American-made new electric car in the 20s. The pickup trucks start around 40, but that's still out of reach for a lot of families. It's why I'm so glad that the new legislation that the president signed actually includes tax credits for used vehicles as well as new ones. On the environmental side, having more EVs obviously helps with climate and fossil fuel issues. There are other issues, though, like the materials going into the batteries. We're working to make sure more of those materials are sourced and refined here in the U.S. or in friendly countries. And the Department of Energy just put out new funding just earlier this week in order to help support that. We need to make sure that this EV revolution, which, let's be honest, it's coming either way. But we need to make sure that it's a made in America electric vehicle revolution that's creating as many American jobs as possible, and one that's affordable for American families to take advantage of.
What's interesting is seeing even the airlines trying to go more green. But in the here and now, this summer, many passengers faced a lot of canceled flights. They faced struggles just getting refunds from airlines, and you have kind of put some pressure on the airlines to basically say, get it together. Where are we at as far as refining those passenger rights and educating passengers about what their rights are, but also making sure that airlines are stepping up and meeting the demands appropriately?
Yeah, we'll work with the airlines when they're doing the right thing, but we're going to hold them accountable when they're not. And we saw a lot of issues with passengers not getting the refunds they deserved and not getting the flight experience that they paid for. So there are three sets of things that we're doing. First of all, enforcement. We're getting complaints from customers. If you have a problem, you can let us know at the DOT, especially on something like getting a refund, and we will have your back. We're preparing law enforcement actions right now, or rule enforcement actions on that side of the house to hold airlines accountable. Secondly, we are raising the bar on what the rules actually are. We're clarifying what it means to, in the eyes of the department, for example, to have a situation like an unreasonable delay that you ought to be entitled to a refund for. The third thing we're doing, transparency. We've created a tool at our website that passengers can use to find out, comparing side by side, which of the top airlines will do something like rebook you on another airline if you get stuck, or take care of your meal or hotel, and which ones won't. And it was amazing to see, just within days of me announcing and letting the airlines know that we were going to put that website up, in a matter of days, we went from 0 of the top 10 airlines committing in writing that they'll provide vouchers for hotels and meals and that kind of thing, to 9 out of the top 10. So we know that transparency has an effect. Just alongside things like enforcing hard rules, we're going to do both.
So to that, what is your message with the holidays coming up? Thanksgiving, Christmas, Orlando, a major departure and destination city, 50 million people flying in a year. What's your message to Americans flying?
Well, the basic message is we have your back. We saw what happened this summer. I experienced it too. As you might imagine, I'm on an airliner just about every day, certainly every week. And we've seen those cancellations and delays, and they're not acceptable. We've seen the rates improve from the worst days of the summer to where we are now. Those cancellation and delay rates have been cut by about half, but I still have some concerns going into Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays, and we're going to be watching closely to make sure that airlines are doing the right thing and getting the information out to passengers so they know their rights.
3 last quick questions for you here. 1, general aviation interest is huge. It's grown so much, but also too with the infrastructure, with commercial flights growing, there's always been need to invest in FAA and control centers and things like that. How is the FAA supporting not only the technology, the need for pilots, the need for controllers? What's the FAA's role in making aviation more robust and modern?
So Florida has some of the most complex airspace in the country, and America has the most complex airspace in the world. You've got a lot of passenger traffic, multiple airports, passenger aviation, general aviation, and around here you also have airspace impacted by space launches, military operations, all happening at the same time. Plus, we're seeing more and more people using drones and more interest in commercial space travel that's going to take that space traffic, which of course has to go through the national airspace on its way up. That's adding complexity too. So FAA is on a journey to modernize not just rules and regulations, but technology and operations. It's another thing, it's a little bit back of house. Most people might not see it, but it's one of the things I'm very glad was in the president's infrastructure law, because having that kind of funding allows FAA to get more updated technology and the staff that we're going to need in order to deal with an airspace that's going to look very different in the 2050s, which isn't that far off, than it did in the 1950s when a lot of these systems were first created.
You actually hinted right at my last two questions. In the spring, the FAA said it was taking steps to address air traffic control staffing to accommodate and increase the launch cadence in Florida. I mean, we could have over 100 launches next year. What do the logistics look like in the conversations to ensure a smooth transition?
Well, for us, it's all about safety. So the biggest thing we're focused on is making sure that these launch operations are safe and that they're deconflicted with anything that's going on with, for example, passenger air travel and general aviation. We've been able to make sure that there's a stronger pipeline of training to have air traffic controllers on site here in Florida. COVID blew a hole in our training pipeline. As you imagine, this is not something you can do from home or out of a book or on Zoom, but we're recovering from that and looking to the future. And this is going to be one of the most interesting and complicated places in the country when it comes to keeping that airspace safe, secure, and efficient so that things can still move as they need to.
And lastly, to that point, I mean, Department of Defense has expressed interest in using launch vehicles as a means to move cargo from one point on the planet to another point. From a DOT perspective, where are the conversations at with that on whether there's commercial viability for such an idea and how that may roll out and function?
So I'm not ready to weigh in formally on that particular concept, but I will say generally, we try to make sure that anytime the Department of Defense or any of the space operators or NASA are doing something that could have an impact on passenger and other aviation, that we're getting the right people to the table. And we're working to make sure that the right conversations are happening, sometimes several times a day in terms of an operational cadence, to keep things moving, keep things flowing, and make sure, especially if you're just experiencing all this as a passenger, that this doesn't affect you in any unreasonable way.
My last question, do you ever let Cheston win at Ticket to Ride?
Cheston beats me fair and square more often than not when we're those rare occasions we can relax over a board game or something.
One of your favorite games. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.